Is everyone seeing a pretty picture of the neon sign that I made? Yeah, great. Good. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for being here. Again, my name is Jeremy Ebersole. I am on the board of directors of the Society for Commercial Archaeology, joined a few years ago and was the vice president for a number of years, and currently living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I'm the executive director of the Milwaukee Preservation Alliance. And what I'm going to be talking about this evening is primarily my research from my thesis. I just recently completed my master's in historic preservation at the University of Oregon in Portland. So there'll be some academic pieces in here, but hopefully I will try to keep it still fun and with lots of cool practical tips, I think, as well. So if I do it right, I'll talk for 50 minutes or so, and then we can have some time at the end to chat and have some questions. But yeah, so I'm super excited to talk to all of you. My passion for neon.
Can I ask everyone to mute themselves so that we only hear Jeremy for now, please? Or Michael, maybe you can do that for us, whatever you like.
Good. Thanks, Nancy. Yes, good point. I was hearing a little feedback. I'm actually going to kick it off with a fun video that they made back at the University of Oregon. They put together a video. So I'm just going to quickly switch over to that share so everyone can see this very high quality, actually, video that was put together about all of this, which is super fun. And where did it go? Give me one quick second. Oh, there we go. Technology, we're getting there. It'll be worth it. Cool. So this is about 3 minutes or so, but I think really captures all of this pretty well.
Neon is truly an artisan craft, with every bend made by hand. Each neon sign is unique, and they make the places they shine on unique too. If you listen close enough, you can hear the actual buzzing of the electrodes, charging them with electricity. It is really something that is alive. We have more neon in Portland than anywhere I've lived, but there is only a fraction of what there once was, and signs are disappearing all the time. When a community loses its historic environment, it loses its soul. I've realized I'm an advocate for old places at heart, and that historic preservation was the best way to teach people the importance of protecting places that make communities vibrant. A place really does not need to be a Civil War battlefield to be significant. Diners, motels, movie theaters, neon signs are all just as important to preserve as colonial mansions. Unfortunately, a lot of the neon that you see today isn't complete. The signs are still beautiful, but they're missing letters, they're missing tubes, and so you just don't get the complete picture. They've gone dark.
Bluetooth's on.
I've watched too many places lose what makes them unique because they didn't recognize the value of what they already had.
People, please mute.
But you can't construct the community's heart brand new. It has to be imbued in a place over time by the people who care about it. My hope is to work with diverse communities to help them recognize the value of their own towns and neighborhoods just as they are. My master's terminal project focuses on how decision makers and advocates in Portland can use a combination of regulations, economic incentives, and public outreach to protect the incredible collection of neon signs here. The good news is that my generation is a generation of preservationists. We want to be in places that are unique, that have character. Right now is a crucial time to enact policies that ensures that the neon gems that define our neighborhoods remain to brighten people's lives long into the future.
Oops. I promise I practiced this. Okay.
It's not full screen yet.
There we go. Are we back on full screen?
I think so.
Okay.
I don't know, I
Great.
see-
Actually, you're sharing your notes
Oh,
version.
we got the notes. Oh my goodness. Okay. Okay. Sorry about this, everyone. Screen share. PowerPoint. Great. Still notes or no notes?
Notes.
Notes. Oh my goodness.
But it's on the right. It's not on the bottom. I don't know what that is.
Yeah. That is
You're in
still-
presenter mode, actually, Jeremy.
All right. Great. So after a long delay. So real quick, what I'm gonna chat about this evening with everyone. I'll talk a little bit about kind of Portland and some of the cool neon that's there. I want to go in then and talk a little bit about the historic context of neon, so kind of where neon comes from, kind of the different time frames where neon kind of grows, is popular, dies down a little bit, and then has come back over the last few decades. Talk about exactly why I think these neon signs are so cool and why they're worth preserving, and then some of the tools that exist currently for preserving neon signs in the historic preservation world, and why they sometimes aren't quite adequate. Yes, and then I look at a couple fun case studies, and some of the people on this call I know were instrumental in helping me do some of this research. So you may hear your name. Some people on this call are talking about how great you are and the great things that you've been doing, and then some recommendations for how any of us can advocate for these signs and work with nonprofits or kind of encourage our city government to take some steps to preserve these cool signs. And I'll mention while I'm on this slide that this building still exists. The neon is gone, but that very cool rotating bread basket or bread loaf on the top actually was just restored a few years ago. It's about 2 years ago. So again, my interest in all of this, there is me and the rest of the SCA crew. Lots of you are probably there. This is in Dayton, Ohio. And my little plug here to join our tours, which we will be doing again starting next year out in the real world. But again, was really interested in talking about neon, because again, I've been on the board for a few years. Just really love neon signs, and was amazed when I moved to Portland for my graduate program how much neon there was in Portland. I did not have in my mind that Portland is a neon city, but it really is. And so as I was studying preservation, I thought this is a perfect opportunity for me to do this work. And interestingly, the building where Portland's or the University of Oregon's preservation program is located is right underneath essentially the logo for the city, what's called the White Stag sign, this massive neon sign that is on the building where the University of Oregon is located. So it just seemed like a perfect fit. So a little bit about that sign, because I can't do this without throwing some love at Portland neon. This is that sign which you saw in the video. Again, they light Rudolph, they light the stag's nose up every holiday season to make him look like Rudolph, which is super fun. But yeah, this neon spectacular is owned by the city, is essentially the unofficial logo for the city. It's on T-shirts and stickers. It's in the convention center. There's pictures of it in the airport. If you fly into Portland, there's a whole big display essentially copying signs from around the city, which is super fun. And you can see here the ways that this particular sign has changed many times over the years. Rehabilitated at least 3 times. It's one of very few properties of any kind in Portland that's protected as a local landmark. And it was most recently saved in 2010, thanks to some really significant local advocacy and philanthropy, some committed city commissioners, and a financial deal that was so complicated that printing it out for distribution to all of the partners broke the printer that they were using to print everything. but totally worth it, and an amazing sign that you see anytime you cross the river in Portland. Just a little more love for Portland neon. One of the things that I love about Portland is that the neon is really everywhere. I think in some cities, if there are strategies that protect neon in certain neighborhoods. Portland, I think, is really great because it's everywhere around the city, and there's quite a bit of new neon that's being made as well. So there's this good balance of old and new neon. So I did, as part of my research, this survey, which I think is the most complete, though not totally comprehensive, survey of neon signs that has been undertaken in Portland, and mapped about 200 of them around the city that's here. And that is the little link if anybody is interested in kind of exploring that at any point. I definitely encourage you when you go up to Portland to check them out. And it's the Laurelhurst Theater, which is just a gem. They've done some painting on it. Yeah, so then jumping back into the meat of the presentation here, moving on from how great Portland is, we're going to talk now primarily about just neon around the country. So what I'm thinking about here is we have this issue that neon is not protected in many of our cities and is continuing to disappear all over the place. So how do we help decision makers understand that neon is important and get them to successfully protect it? How can we do that? So my thesis, essentially, that I'm working on, or the point of my talk in non-academic terms, is that neon signs provide all of these benefits, and we should really focus our advocacy efforts on looking at this combination of regulations and economic incentives and public outreach, and kind of looking at what's been done around the country to help, because the cities make decisions based oftentimes on what other cities have done successfully. So the more we can show city decision makers that this has worked in other places, I think it's more likely for cities to undertake these kinds of efforts. So a couple of fun things to start off with, just so we all understand kind of what we're talking about. So I don't really, I'm not talking, this is basically like policy and advocacy. I'm not talking at all about like the physical conservation of neon signs, like how to make sure that the tubes light again. Like that physical conservation stuff has been done really well with a booklet called Saving Neon that was put out by the folks at San Francisco Neon a few years ago. So highly recommend that book. I'm also not really going to talk at all about new neon, though I think new neon is a great way to encourage a neon aesthetic in a city that can be helpful for old neon as well, but not going to talk much about that. And then there's this question of, like what does it mean to save a sign? Like when I'm talking about saving a sign, like what does that actually mean that a sign is saved? So there's various ways that you can think about this. You can preserve the sign. So essentially what's there is great, and we should just keep that and make sure it doesn't deteriorate. And then rehabilitation, which I think is really valuable. Essentially, so keeping a sign and altering some of the, and this can be semi-controversial, but altering some of the content on the sign to reflect the current business. So something like this picture, Sahara Apartments, that was obviously at one point the Sahara Motel. So allowing businesses to be able to change that wording to reflect the current business while maintaining some of the things that are like character defining for the sign. So things like the letter style and the coloring and the use of neon and those types of things can actually make these things more practical to be used by current business owners. And then you can restore signs, which is usually what we're talking about when we talk about signs, restoring them, replacing what's, saving what we can, replacing what's there with new neon. Can also be things like recreating an existing sign. This third one in Denver that I have there was originally looked like this Mozart lounge sign, was changed to this kind of gross, just painted with the word aqua, and then they restored it and brought it back to what it was originally. And then the Portland theater sign there in Portland, that was a total reconstruction, built from scratch to match what was there originally. So all of those, I think, are solid ways to kind of preserve what we have in the environment for neon. And then there's this question of LED, which is important to talk about when we're talking about neon. I think obviously we probably all know that neon is being replaced by LED more and more. This is ostensibly done as a cost-saving, energy-saving method, and I generally would say this is not the best idea. I would say if it's the only alternative to a sign's destruction, then I would say that it's better than losing the entire sign. Some would disagree, but it's just, as I think we all probably know, it doesn't have quite the same quality and is significantly less environmentally friendly than neon. And then there's this question of kind of like where does the sign go, and like what counts as saving a sign. So I think my sense is that these are really best if they're where they always have been. If we can save signs in the environment, then they're really able to tell the story of that place. They're available to the public to see. And then from there, I think the more public access, the better, essentially. So we can relocate signs in the public realm. This is what you see with sign parks, which are a super cool way of preserving signs. And then museums, obviously, you have public access, but there's a cost barrier there. And then in a personal collection, as I would say is better than the sign being totally destroyed. There's a possibility that it can be out in the world again, but then you just don't have the public access. So again, all of these valid ways, but generally thinking that keeping them where they have been in the environment is kind of the best way to think about it. Yeah, so a little bit of fun history of neon here. How do we get where we are today? And I'll go way too quickly through this. But so neon signs introduced in the 1910s, originally most recent of many experiments prior to that in gas tube lighting, and again, really couldn't overemphasize how popular they were during this early period prior to in the interwar period, essentially. They're more energy efficient considerably and required a lot less maintenance than the incandescent bulb signs that were there before them. And they have this, very cool streamlined look that fits in really well with kind of the Art Deco architecture of the time. And they're during this time, and really, all over inner cities, and are symbols of like glamour and urban modernity very much. But of course, these things don't last, and times change. So by the 80s, many decades later, what was 2,000 or so neon plants around the country at the height has dwindled down to about 250. So we've lost quite a bit there as far as production. And the image also kind of changes from one of really exuberance and modernity to this idea of kind of seediness and decay. And I think one of the best examples of that is It's a Wonderful Life, 1946. And you have George Bailey when he comes back, and as if he'd never existed, instead of beautiful Bedford Falls with all of its quaint New England charm and not a neon sign in sight, we end up in Potterville, where there's nothing but neon signs flickering and buzzing and advertising dens of iniquity. And this is kind of where one of the early harbingers of where kind of that image was going, unfortunately. There's a lot of reasons for this. Some of the kind of the natural march of progress. New things are always coming out, and they're cheaper. So now people want plastic signs. They're newer and they're cheaper. There's also kind of this desire after the Second World War for a break with the pre-war way of life. Like we've gone through this experience together. We need to start doing things in a new way. And so things from before the war are seen really as kind of old and kind of outdated at the time. The war also mandated blackouts in many cities, which leads to maintenance issues, for many of these signs that weren't lit for a number of years. And of course, you have bigger societal things. There's this mass exodus of wealth from cities where these signs are located, and it kind of leads neon to being synonymous with blight, kind of that same urban decay that you're seeing in the cities is obviously affecting signs and their image. And then there's business trends also. So things like chain stores are growing more and more. They require less personalization. They don't have sign companies essentially making the logo for a small business anymore. You have a chain that is, that is wanting everything to be standardized, and neon is not a standardized thing. I mean, it's a handcrafted art, and so they're moving to different technologies. At the same time, of course, signs are moving with the people. They're going out into the more suburban area, and they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger and brighter in this attempt to attract, automobile travelers who are more and more in cars and moving faster and faster. And so the signs get bigger and they're kind of integrated into the architecture. So this is where you get a lot of the roadside stuff that a lot of us SCA people really love, and Googie architecture, coffee shops and drive-ins and these things. So yeah, the 1950s and 60s gave us a lot of these kind of big motel and other signs that are really synonymous with the roadside architecture we love. At the same time, so there's always been anti-sign feelings. This is not new to neon. It's not new in the 60s. There are accounts of people decrying the amounts of signage in commercial business districts in Europe in the 1800s. So yeah, there's this idea that has always existed that kind of brash commercialism that signs reflect is something that really kind of sullies natural beauty. And architecture, which of course is also man-made, but is not considered as unsightly, I guess, by anti-sign folks.
It's the history of neon.
This kind of reaches a fever pitch in this era, though, and so there's the American Planning Association has this.
Just dump that in there with it.
From this, perhaps. No, I know. If you're not talking real quick. Yeah, so the APA said during this time, perhaps no environmental or land use issue evoked more discussion and debate during the 1950s and 60s than did aesthetics and sign control. So this really kind of kicks off in full gear with the 1954 Supreme Court decision called Berman versus Parker, which gives cities the ability to use the police power that every city has to regulate beauty. So this really opens the door for cities to start cracking down on things that they consider not beautiful, which unfortunately was signage a lot of the time. So these beautification efforts got a big boost when it kind of becomes the pet project of Lady Bird Johnson, First Lady. Culminates in 1965 with the Highway Beautification Act, which calls for the removal of clutter along federal highways. And it's really aimed at billboards, but the reverberation is felt kind of all over on all signs. Sign companies themselves are eager to disassociate themselves with this image problem that signs have, and so they are among the most egregious at the time in removing these signs. There's one big PR campaign that happened called Scrap Old Signs, a nationwide campaign around the country where members of the sign companies around the country get together. And one day in September, take down about 300 old signs, primarily neon, all around the country and scrap them. Of course, it's a great way for them to sell more new signs at the same time. But it's really interesting. Yeah, the sign companies were taking down these signs en masse during this time. And then you start to see these restrictive sign codes that have done just incredible damage to signs over the years. So we have sign codes again, and I don't mean to say bad things about sign codes in general, but the restrictiveness of many of them was really challenging for neon. And so you have these codes that are regulating the number and the size and the type and the placement and the illumination and the motion of signs. So you can kind of regulate neon out of existence. Sometimes these codes would require any non-conforming sign. So a sign that doesn't meet these new requirements, they could say they have to come down within 5 years or 10 years. They can make repair of signs essentially illegal by not allowing like non-conforming signs to come down for repair and then go back up. So it makes it impossible to fix them. And these codes, sorry to say, still exist in many places around the country, though there are some great examples I'll talk about that are working on fixing that. And they've just, resulted in tons and tons of signs disappearing. And historic preservation, which we might think would be advocates for not tearing down these cool aspects of our cultural heritage, at this time are really pretty complicit in this. In preservation, generally, the standard is that something has to be at least 50 years old before it is considered historic, which lots of us don't agree with. These signs at the time are often not 50 years old, so they're not considered important to save. And preservation also has this real kind of fascination with the original, what was built. And so additions, changes, I think are often, at the time especially, were not appreciated for the value that they add. So preservationists are often seeing these signs as pimples on these perfectly unblemished buildings. And you have things like the Main Street program, which was a preservation initiative that started around this time, still exists. A great program as a way to kind of combat urban renewal that's knocking down all these beautiful old buildings and building kind of suburban style developments in the city and saying, no, your old buildings can be valuable and they can help with economic development. Like the way to redevelop your struggling city is not to knock down your buildings, it's to keep them. But oftentimes that also meant kind of returning these cities to this imagined Victorian era look where everything was perfect and clean and removing anything from the 20th century, including signs. And again, this has gotten better, but you have a lot of damage done during that time. So we kind of get better then in the 80s, 70s and 80s. Resurgence kicks off in the late 70s. I think artists start to discover neon as a medium to work in. You have postmodernist architects coming around this time who really celebrate kind of playfulness and color and are really excited about kind of bringing back classical elements into architecture. And so neon becomes a part of that as like architectural elements, if not always as signs. And then, of course, we have the nostalgia of kind of the baby boomer generation and kind of this worship of Americana that probably all of us in this call are, regardless of our age, are interested in. And then millennials, folks in my generation and younger, I think are really interested in this sense of authenticity and personal expression. And this is really good for neon because neon is handcrafted. It's seen as something that is just super authentic. And so a lot of new neon that's being made now is often text-based, like this here on the Mission Theater. A lot of it is actually going up indoors where you don't have to worry about sign codes or things regulating your creativity. And preservation also does redeem itself in the 90s. There are things called preservation briefs that the National Park Service puts out that kind of governs how historic preservationists work. And this preservation brief in the 90s actually starts to encourage the trend of cities and communities enacting ordinances that recognize old signs and permit them to be kept. So we saw some improvement. So why does all of this matter now that we know what we got here? Why do we want to keep signs around? A couple reasons that I talk about. I think placemaking is a big one. Signs just have incredible power to create a sense of place in a community. This quote I love, it's from City Lab. If a city can be read, signage is a form of shorthand. Local signs give cities their unique character in the face of encroaching hegemony where every main street looks the same. And I think that, again, that handcrafted unique nature of neon is something that is really powerful. And they can also be used to create places where they didn't exist. These photos in Edmonton and in Casa Grande are sign parks. Again, these are usually free open air museums of signs that, again, moving signs from the community or elsewhere and kind of creating a park or an attraction of these neon signs, which has been a really successful way in many communities of saving a lot of these signs. I also talk about passion, I think is something that's super important. People are just passionate about neon. Obviously, we are lots of those people in the SCA. And this is evidence of it not only by all of the coffee table books on neon artists making their living off of neon photography, blogs, social media accounts. This is from a gentleman named Chris Raley, who makes these amazing acrylic models of neon signs. This is the kind of passion that you just don't see with every element of the built environment. What is the purpose of saving things if not to save the things that matter to people? And obviously there's this economic argument that if people like neon signs, then they will shop at places with neon signs. So whenever I talk about this, I encourage, if you like neon signs, go to places that have neon signs, buy something there and tell the person behind the counter that you are there because they have a neon sign and you love their neon sign, and that will help them decide to keep their neon sign up and running. When I'm talking about with preservationists about any of this, I also mention that this passion is really for neon signs is held by lots of people who don't always identify with the larger historic preservation movement, and provides a way to kind of get a broader audience interested in historic preservation and move away from this perception of preservation as kind of stodgy and elitist, because neon signs are certainly not that. They also represent, I think, our cultural heritage in a really significant way. This is often the heritage of diverse populations as well. The preservation brief I mentioned earlier says that old signs, quote here, often reflect the ethnic makeup of a neighborhood and its character, as well as the social and business activities carried out there. Again, so these signs are representing the people who lived and made these places what they are, and often those are diverse and ethnic communities as well. There's in 2012, Better Homes and Gardens of all people did a poll polling over 100,000 consumers all over the country in all 50 states, found that 77% agreed with the statement that vintage signs are worth preserving due to their historic and cultural value. Only 4% of people disagreed with this. Again, so lots of folks understand that these are part of our heritage. And I think the prevalence of sign museums, dedicated sign museums, is evidence of this, that this is part of our culture. Again, there are now, to my knowledge, 6 dedicated sign museums in the US. We've got Museum of Neon Art out in Glendale, California, the Neon Museum in Las Vegas, and the American Sign Museum in Cincinnati. Are now kind of the old guard, but half of these have opened just in the last 3 years. So this is getting more popular. We have the Ignite Sign Art Museum in Tucson, Arizona, National Neon Sign Museum in the Dalles, Oregon, and then the Neon Museum of Philadelphia, which just opened this year. And again, you see neon in collections of places from the Henry Ford to the Smithsonian, lots of local museums as well. Also, I think we all know that neon is legitimately art. Every neon sign is handmade by an artisan. It takes years to perfect this craft. I have never done it. It looks hard. There's a lot that goes into it. It takes years to perfect this skill. It was actually recognized by the British Heritage Craft Association recently, recognized tube bending as an endangered craft in the UK. And lastly, I think in the times that we are living in currently, especially, we really need to think about the environmental impacts of what we're doing, along with having kind of the embodied energy. By that I mean, like, these things already exist, so there's been a lot of resources put into creating them that have been extracted from the earth. We've got that, but I'd add this great quote from the Saving Neon booklet that I mentioned earlier. It says, "Adapting neon to LEDs turns an artful treasure that can last more than 50 years made from sustainable and recyclable materials by skilled hands into a thing that is unrecyclable and made chiefly from unsustainable petroleum products, a thing that may not last even a decade. So don't let people tell you that LED is better for the environment than neon. That's one of my many soapboxes, I guess. Yeah, so now that we've kind of talked a little bit about kind of the history of neon, talked about why we want to keep them around, I want to talk more about some of the specific tools that we have to protect neon, which shows some strengths, but also some real gaps in what we do. Looking at the national level, and again, I kind of like to focus on, the carrot and the stick. You've got regulations that protect signs, and then as a stick, and then carrots that incentivize people to keep signs. As far as incentives, there aren't a whole lot, unfortunately, at the national level. The primary financial incentive to preserve places in the United States are historic tax credits, which provide money back for doing restoration of buildings in a way that maintains their historic character. Signs are explicitly excluded from using historic tax credits. So there goes the biggest preservation incentive that exists. Unfortunately, there are some grants from places like the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the National Park Service, that can be used for neon, but there's nothing, to my knowledge, devoted specifically to sign preservation on the national level. Outreach and advocacy, I think, also really important. As far as national groups. Oh, and here's my cat. There's a great group on Facebook called Signs United. That's a group of advocates who are able to help think about how to preserve signs. And then, of course, San Francisco Neon. I'm just gonna get rid of my cat here real quick. Oh. Sorry about that. San Francisco Neon has become really international in scope with a conference called Neon Speaks that I believe just finished their 3rd year. Going into the 4th year this year, will be virtual again this year, and just a great way to bring together neon advocates, sign artists, scholars, photographers, anyone interested in neon. Just a great community at the national level to advocate for signs and show that there's a connected community that's interested in signs. So then again, regulations is what we talk about a lot of the time in historic preservation, where I am interested. So there's this section that I won't get too deep into of the national or the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, which is kind of the foundational document for preservation, called Section 106, and it basically says that if there's federal money involved in anything, the federal agency has to think about whether what they're doing will impact a historic place. And so this actually has been used to protect, signs in, there's one in Grants Pass, a small community in Oregon that was replacing a bridge. So that's federal highway dollars. Because of that, they're required to say, will this bridge replacement affect any historic elements in the area? There's a sign that was right there by the bridge. And because of that, they're able to identify that sign was important and get some money to protect it. So this kind of federal regulation can be helpful if things like bridge projects or things like that are happening. And then we've got the National Register for Historic Places, which is the kind of official national list of officially historic places worthy of preservation kept by the National Park Service. There are about 95,000 places on the National Register. Of the 95,000 places, including historic districts, there are 16 signs total that are listed individually on the National Register. Some are part of districts, but 16 signs are considered significant enough that they can be listed individually on the National Register. Of those, only 6 of them are neon. They're all listed here. And it's probably fairly small on your screen, unfortunately. I apologize. But not many is the point. The first one listed was the Shell sign here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But in the last 10 years, a lot of the signs that have been listed have been neon. So we're seeing an uptick. 2 of the 3 in the last 10 years that have been listed signs have been neon, including this walking man sign that was the most recent one as of last year. So it's a small number, but it does show that signs can be considered historically significant and that it is appropriate to designate them and protect them. Going to move on then to some of the kind of the fun local best practices. So this is kind of getting into the city level, some of the fun things that have been done to protect neon around the country. So these are kind of good ideas. If you want to download the whole 300-page paper, I'll put a link at the end. And I talk about all of these great things that are happening. I looked at about 20 cities around the country. And yeah, so these are, I'm going to talk about a couple of these and then dive into kind of two of the top tier programs. I'm going to just get rid of the cat again. All right. Yeah, so as far as regulations, one way that has been used is kind of creating special districts. So these are basically cities can segment out a special district and say, in this area, neon is encouraged. And you can do that through kind of special sign code allowances that lets you do certain things here that you can't do in the rest of the city. You can reduce fees in those areas to promote sign restoration. And again, a cool idea, helps signs in the district, but doesn't do anything if you're, across the street, unfortunately. So a good start, but it does get better. One of the big ones that is just super important that I really love is vintage sign ordinances. So these are essentially ways to create changes in the code for the city that allows zoning code or sign code that allows for signs to be listed, signs that meet a certain criteria, generally listed in some kind of a special list that says these are the important signs in the city. And there are a couple ways that has been done. You can do an inventory, essentially going around the city and identifying what are the important signs, or you can just allow businesses to apply for the program and say, I want to apply for this because I get these special benefits from that. And the benefits that can come with listing in one of these ordinances can be kind of exempting them from the base sign code. So saying all these rules that apply to signs, you don't need to follow all of those. Things that allow for signs to be relocated or reconstructed from scratch or rehabilitated with new wording that reflects the business, but kind of keeps the historic character of the signs. Some cities have done a plaque just to recognize it as a historic sign. But all things that incentivize a business owner to want to list their sign and protect it. And then the protections that can come with these, also can vary, but can be things like demolition delays. Like if you want to demolish this sign and it's listed, you need to wait 180 days or something, or they can potentially need to go through a city review board that says that needs to determine if they can be demolished and have kind of a high burden of proof there. So a super cool way to protect signs. As far as incentives, there aren't many local grants that I know of either. But I would mention the National Park Service's Route 66 Corridor Cost Share Grant Program, which is a great program. There's a matching grant for businesses along Route 66. It funded about 35 projects up through 2019. And not specific to neon, but all but 2 of the projects actually involved neon. And I talk about this because the incentives, like helping people financially restore signs with grants, if you follow the trail, these grants from the Park Service have led to not just sign restorations, but helped with sign surveys, like I just talked about, or inventories. New Mexico made an advocacy brochure to hand out to city governments. They created a model sign code in New Mexico as well to help governments say, this is how you can protect signs exactly in your sign code, and all kinds of other things. So it kind of shows how powerful these incentives can be in creating momentum out of it. And then advocacy outreach, fancy name, inspiration oriented DIY conservation, which is long, but is what it sounds like. So a fancy way of saying when a city or nonprofit just restores signs themselves instead of dealing with grants, so we're just going to come in and we're going to do it. And this is done often in the name of public art. or economic revitalization. So saying that this neighborhood is depressed. If we can show that good things are happening, we can spend a little bit of money, come in here and fix up this sign, and it will encourage other business owners to do the same and generate interest in the area. And this was used along with the survey and historic designation in Los Angeles, actually to restore 185 signs over the years, which numbers wise is far and away the most successful sign preservation program in the country based on numbers. So obviously it's a resource intensive method, but it offers a lot of control. And then as far as, building awareness, lots of great ways that this can be done. All kinds of grassroots activism, and you can create organized groups. This has happened in Denver with Save Old Signs, I believe. In this group, the benefit of these groups is that it lets the community and owners know that there are people who care about this, and it also can put social pressure on business owners to protect the signs and provide a place for them to go for advice. Sometimes a sign owner may want to preserve their sign. They don't know who to go to help them do that or understand what to do. Groups like this, a business owner can then just, search for, neon sign, reservation in Denver. So, and then the group comes up and he knows, okay, I can ask these people about how to do this, and there's someone who can help me. And that can go a long way. Also, there's been printed tour guide booklets of neon signs done in a number of cities. Fundraising events around raising money for neon signs. Crowdfunding has been used successfully. And of course, these are cool because anybody can do any of this. It doesn't take lots of resources. But I think it works best when you do all of these together, as is often the case. Tulsa, Oklahoma, as an example, got one of these Route 66 grants I mentioned for one of their larger signs. It was endangered. The city stepped in to save the sign, took ownership of the sign. A nonprofit did a survey of signs around the city, created a tour guide, and all of this raised awareness enough to the point that neon was included in the city's strategic plan that they're putting together, which included a special district to protect neon and grant funding to help that happen. Knoxville is another cool example of a different way of doing it. There was a local nonprofit that partnered with the local corporation who restored their own sign and then donated a percentage of their sales over a period of time to the organization to redistribute as grants to other neon sign preservation programs in the region. And because of that awareness, again, the city revised their sign code to create a historic sign ordinance and do more to protect all the other signs in the city as well. So with that, I know I'm running long, but I'm going to zip through some of my two favorites, San Francisco and Tucson. San Francisco has a really diverse and robust program, and this kind of gets kicked off in 1998. Initially, they enact their first vintage sign ordinance, was updated then in 2011. The signs from the code allows restoration, reconstruction, relocation. Says that they can't be removed from that list without planning commission approval. And we've only gotten about 4 signs, to my knowledge, listed with this, but it also helped to start foster an environment of receptivity in the city to other neon sign preservation efforts, which really got going with our friends at San Francisco Neon, who may be on the call this evening. But just, a standout organization. Really, the nation's largest neon preservation group, to my mind, came on the scene in the mid 2010s or so as a part-time project of Randall Ann Homan and Al Barna, who did an amazing job leading this organization. Started with a self-published book, collection of signed photos in 2014, kind of snowballs from there. They worked with the Central Library in the city to put up an exhibit of new and historic photos of neon signs, published a catalog of that, and then partnered with the local museum, the Tenderloin Museum in a neighborhood there in the city, to form the actual San Francisco Neon Group, and now do exhibitions at the museum, talks, serve as kind of sign designers, restoration consultants, do neon walking tours that are super popular around the city. And then, as I mentioned, became really national with the Neon Speaks, and international with the Neon Speaks conference. And in 2009, around the same time, the city launches this program called San Francisco Shines, which is a storefront improvement grant. So seven signs were restored through that program through 2018. San Francisco Neon again is able to get involved there when they noticed that the quality wasn't always the best on some of those signs. Went to the program director at the city, who was happy for the technical help and helped spur the creation of that Saving Neon booklet to create national best practices for how to actually do the restoration. And then this led to another partnership called Neon A to Z between San Francisco Neon and the city, with the goal of restoring 4 signs in that Tenderloin district every year. The nonprofit helped by doing a survey, kind of identifying candidates in the neighborhood. The city would reach out to the candidates, and then San Francisco Neon would help again with technical assistance, and we're able to do 3 of those in 2019. So the San Francisco has bringing together all of these facets. They got this vintage sign ordinance. They did a survey. There's an active nonprofit that's kind of leading the way. There's a grant program, and then these kind of creative partnerships bringing everything together. And then Tucson, another very cool city, was once you would not have said was the best city for signs. There's a 1970s Life magazine article that calls one of the streets in Tucson the ugliest street in America, largely because of the big signs, which led to some pretty restrictive sign codes in the city. The transformation here starts again with the nonprofits' success in creating this culture of neon appreciation. This is the Tucson Historic Preservation Foundation. They start getting involved in neon in 2010. It's a way to match kind of the limited resources of the group. Again, neon is cheaper to restore than a building generally, and a way to also reach the community and underserved communities, and a way to kind of connect preservation to the fabric of everyday life. So they got a grant initially to create one of these guidebooks around the city, did a survey to find the best signs to include in this guidebook. And I was able to visit, and all these years later, 28 of the 30 that are still standing as of last year. And they worked with a local community college and a neighborhood association that recognized the neon as an asset in their community, and created this cool sign park that's on the side of the screen here on the median, essentially there, kind of some dead land as a way to help revitalize the neighborhood. And of course, interestingly, none of this was technically legal at the time. So they had to change the code to make it so. And that happened around 2009 as well. There was an old inn right downtown that was purchased. The new owner wanted to restore the sign, but it was not legal to do so. So it kicked off this 2-year process that created this historic landmark sign ordinance, one of the first in the country at the time, applied to the entire city, and lets businesses essentially sign up. They create a treatment plan that says how they'll protect the sign, and then the sign is allowed to be repaired and restored and rehabilitated with new wording, or even relocated in some instances, and is exempted from the site's maximum allowable sign area. So basically, it says that they can still have other signage there, and then it's protected by a demolition delay. It says you can't tear it down without waiting a certain amount of period of time. In this instance, the ability to rehabilitate the sign so the wording can change to reflect the current business, and not counting towards that sign allowance were considered the really important parts of that. They also got some money from the federal government, Housing and Urban Development block grant, to help restore some signs in a specific area. And then there's this wonderful individual named Jude Cook, who runs a neon shop in the city. Opened the Ignite Sign Art Museum in 2018, helped restore many, if not all, of the signs around the city, who is just a great advocate, helped with the code. And the museum, again, provides a place to store or save signs that can't be saved, and raises awareness of the value of signs. And so again, here you have this sign ordinance, tour booklet, survey, sign park, grants, museum, all working together to create this kind of complete culture. So just to review kind of all the fun things that we've talked about, what can we do? It takes a village to do all of this. None of us can do it on our own. Best way to save signs, I think, is really kind of pooling together city nonprofits, advocates, and looking at all of these facets, regulations, incentives, and outreach. And anybody here can take any of this information and talk to your city government about implementing some of these policies. Talk to your local preservation nonprofits or your historical society. Encourage them to do what's been done in some of these cities. Again, the regulations are important, again, to make sure that this stuff is legal, it's hassle-free, and it's easy, and that the signs are protected from demolition or kind of inappropriate alteration. So really the biggest thing, I think, are creating these surveys and kind of contexts and let you know what you have in your city. And it provides, for the city government, a rationale for offering special rules and protections for these specific signs. And that can be done, again, following, you do the survey and then you create an ordinance that protects those signs and allows them to be rehabilitated and relocated. Again, it only protects listed signs, so there are lots of things that we can do also to make the code friendlier to neon in general by allowing signs to be restored to an earlier look or reconstructed or relocated as well. And then, of course, as I wrap up, incentives, again, super important. We live in a capitalist market-based society, so we want to do everything we can to make this viable for business owners. So telling city officials neon restoration is worth funding. Storefront grants, like I mentioned, are things that exist in many cities to help businesses restore their storefronts. Some of it can even just be reaching, if that exists in your city, reach out to businesses that have neon signs. Very often these grants can be used to restore neon signs in cities. So sometimes it's just letting the businesses know that this money exists, which it does in many cities. And then as far as advocacy, I touched on a lot of this, but again, building that groundswell of support does not happen by accident. It takes a lot of work and really kind of creating this unified effort, bringing people together in your community who are interested in this and kind of harnessing the power of collective action. I think create a group if there doesn't exist one in your city, advocate, do crowdfunding, start a sign tour, have an event. Get neon in your local museum, have an art exhibit at your library or your history museum, your city archives if it exists. If there are local preservation organizations, they often do most endangered lists. Talk to them about putting neon on one of those lists. Make a tour booklet, publish a coffee table book. All of this can raise the profile of neon in your community. And then again, reaching out to the sign owners to share with them the value of neon and spend your money at those businesses. Real quick at the end, if you want even more about, there's a zillion books on this. I'd call special attention to Rudy Stern. There's a book in 1979 called Let There Be Neon. Chester Liebs, our esteemed founder of the SCA back in the 70s, wrote Main Street to Miracle Mile in 1985. And then Martin True in 2012, or Sign Streets and Storefronts. All of these I think are really foundational in talking about the value of signs in the built environment. Deborah Jane Seltzer is a very good friend of the SCA, also has a great book, 2017, called Vintage Signs of America, that talks about some good neon sign preservation strategies. Lots of regional photo books. I especially recommend New York Neon by Thomas Rinaldi, which has a great in-depth history of neon. And then I would call out what I think is the most recent neon book called Neon: A Light History, which was just recently put out by our friends at San Francisco Neon as well, just earlier this year. And with that, if you want to read the whole thing, there's 300 pages with lots of pictures and charts and all of that. The web address is there on the screen, and you can of course find me on Instagram or email, and definitely encourage, reach out to me at any time if you have questions or ideas or things please don't hesitate to reach out, and download the whole thing, read through it. It is fun reading much of it, and give it, talk about this stuff with your local city decision makers. And so with that, I have not left much time for questions, but I'm a couple minutes over. But I would love if people want to stick around to answer questions. And apologies for the technical difficulties again. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. All right, it looks like most of us stuck it out the whole way through. Excellent.
Jeremy, this is Nancy Sturm.
Hi.
When you presented your thesis to these professors, were they kind of traditional preservationists? So you had to, were they sold on neon before, or did you change their viewpoints after they read your thesis?
Yeah. I was, I think some of my advisors were more traditional preservationists, I think, and was able to help convince them. I think one of my biggest victory was the filmmakers who who made that little video at the beginning had no interest in neon whatsoever, and they just loved making this video. And it's, now I'm going to notice this stuff everywhere, and it's so cool that this exists. I was lucky. I mean, part of why I was drawn to Portland's program, I think, is because there was kind of awareness and understanding of the value of some of these kind of less traditional objects for preservation. I'd say they're getting more traditional. I think preservation is getting a lot better. And Portland, I'd say as well, like the the city friends that I had in the city's preservation office were gung ho about this as well, and say, yeah, like this would be a great for the city of Portland to be able to implement. In the paper that I wrote, there's a whole lot more like specifically directed at Portland. But yeah, so I think like on the West Coast especially, I think there's just a lot of neon in a lot of the cities out there, Portland included, and so yeah, it wasn't totally revolutionary there. But again, we can always use more awareness, I think.
Well, great job. Congratulations.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, Dean, absolutely.
Okay, I live in the Chicago suburbs, okay? And there is a suburb near us called Franklin Park. And for years and years, I would drive by this this old neon sign there for a business called Smithereens, which is a pest control place. And I was always told that that was one of the oldest neon signs in the entire United States. Has anyone else heard of this place? It was a pest. The neon was a big rat. Actually, it was a rat, and it said Smithereens on top. And I noticed it back in the early 80s. I had just joined SCA in the early 80s. That's when I started noticing this stuff. And now the sign is gone. I'm hoping it went to a museum or something. But has anybody ever heard of this place? Was I dreaming this? Because I was told this by several people that was the oldest neon sign in the country. Does that make sense to anybody?
I'm not familiar. I was looking to see if Deborah Jane was on the call.
Oh.
She would be the one, but I don't see her. I don't know. Yeah. Does anybody else?
No one's heard of it?
Dress.
Documented in vintage neon, and they claimed it was one of the oldest. Oh, okay, so Judy.
Yeah, there's some debates I know about. There for a long time it was thought that this Packard sign.
Yeah,
in Los
I
Angeles,
heard that too. Right.
yeah, and I know that finding has been called into question recently. Now that sign doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't.
That sign is in my book, in Vintage Neon, and when I interviewed the people, they claimed that it was one of the oldest signs in the United States, and that when they had to get it fixed, they couldn't splice the glass, the present day glass, to the old glass because the old glass had been Pyrex, and that was part of their evidence that it was, an early 1920s sign is what they had told me.
Right. So you are familiar with the sign then? Okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, because I used to drive by it every day for years and years, and now it's gone. I'm like, oh, I hope it isn't lost. This is obviously a historic sign. So,
Yeah. Thank you. If others don't know, Len Davidson also has an excellent book called Vintage Neon, and opened the Neon Museum of Philadelphia very recently, which I'm very excited to come see at some point.
Oh, and there's Kim Hinder.
Really, Jeremy. I love your, and it was so great to get to see the bigger picture of your thesis. And I still plan to download the 300 pages. So if we just go to that link, we can access it. Is that right?
Yeah, that link. Yeah, or if you just search on academia.org for mine, Jeremy Ebersole, and you can always email SCA and I can make sure to get it. Yeah, and so some of those pictures are photos, so it's not 300 written pages.
but bottom line is a lot of those resources links. I mean, the information is there.
Yes.
But what I wanted to particularly praise in your kind of visualizing how things evolved, and it really set a light bulb in my head when you use the Bedford Falls analogy, that neon, even in the late 40s, post-war, that's seedy. But what actually had occurred was downtowns were declining, and they were seedy, and those were old signs in city cores. And what's interesting is it's only flickered when you made that point, that when I moved in the early 80s into a neighborhood that was struggling to revive itself in a faded and rather depressed commercial strip, what the new owner did as his first step was put in a block-long neon design. That was just temporary. I mean, it wasn't great art, but it transformed the block because people were drawn to the glow of the light and the design. So it's interesting. And of course, Nashville, I saw it before when it was seedy, and now it's like splashy. It's some of the same neon, but there's no question people are drawn to the light and the glow when it's an artistic glow. And so all I can surmise from that is, what made people come around. Well, probably that signs on strips got bigger, bulkier, but not charming. And so then neon began to acquire, I guess, a charm. But I'd be interested in your, that certainly that transformation. It does seem that the main challenge is the steps, as you mentioned. Identify them so that they can be protected, and then look at the ordinances that need to protect them.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, in Los Angeles, it was into that I mentioned it's called the Lumens Project. They restored those 185 signs around Los Angeles with the city. That was the city doing all of that work, and they were dark during the war, and a lot of these rooftop signs were just kind of down and laid on the rooftop. So they actually got a helicopter to do the survey, and they're flying around with a helicopter around Los Angeles downtown and Hollywood and the Westlake neighborhood, and there's a sign, and then find those signs, restore them, and again, as economic development, they were still there. They hadn't been used in 50 years, but they were still there, and they were able to put them back up and restore them and help to in the name of kind of revitalization. Again, because they got that seedy reputation. There's a cool pictures that I have in the paper, like in the 60s, like the same year, and there's a picture of kind of the cover of a trashy dime novel with a woman with a short skirt, and there's a flickering neon light behind, and it's called something about how awful neon is in the title. And then the same year, there's this picture from a magazine of this beautiful primed and well-dressed suburban woman with perfect clothing and advertising fluorescent lights that are there right beside her. And that's what we were dealing with during that time.
You've done a stupendous job of gathering a massive compendium of what has been done, what has worked, and what are all the resources. It's really just astounding.
Yeah, and it can be, there's a lot that can be done, but again, I think pooling together the resources of other people, and again, collective action, working with nonprofits and getting people together, it's an awful lot for any one person to do, but get other people with you, and I guarantee there are people in your community who also think neon signs are cool.
Can I mention something?
Yeah, Russell, of course.
I just wanted to let people know, I put it on chat, but I started a couple months ago posting all of John Margoli's neon sign photographs on the Facebook group that's called Vintage Neon Heaven. So there's got to be between 200 or 300. I'm still working on it because there's so many. And I also posted them on my personal Facebook page. So if you're interested in seeing those pictures, just join that Vintage Neon Heaven group, and you could search the group for my name, and then you'd see all these posts.
Yeah, thank you, Russell. I especially loved the drive-in theaters, I think, that you posted recently. Epic drive-in theater neon on there recently.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Yeah. Thanks, Russell. Yeah, I know we've gone long. But yeah, any other thoughts or questions for anyone? Yeah, encourage everyone, go go visit your local neon museum or neon sign park. Support those guys doing really important work in the community. And yeah, go to places that have neon and buy something and tell them you love their neon.
You have really expanded our bucket list.
Yeah, and visit Portland when you can travel, when you feel safe traveling again. Amazing neon in Portland. Very much should be on everyone's list as a world-class neon city.
Any other questions?
Could I say something? I'm sorry, I somehow wasn't able to get in on the beginning, but there's a private neon museum in Chicago that is not open to the public and has about 25 or 30 neon signs, all restored and working. And the neon signs are on a big courtyard like a basketball floor, and around all the edges are about 50 antique automobiles. And it's in a fellow who runs all of this is a real estate owner or manager, and on the premises he has now, until COVID, it obviously made a change. He had he catered large events that could hold a couple hundred people. But the only way you get in is you had to call him, and then he would have his secretary give you a tour. So it wasn't on any place. And the reason I knew about it is I had half of a neon sign in my garage. There used to be a store in Chicago, and another fellow had the other half called Kitty Kicks Children's Shoes or something like that. And the other fellow had half of it on the wall of one of his kids' rooms, and he didn't want it anymore. So this fellow ended up with both of them and restored it, and it's up on the wall on of a few feet above an antique car, working. So I presume it's been about 3 or 4 years since I've been up there. So I presume if I tried to call them, you could still get in, but I don't know. I haven't tried to really.
Excellent. And I'm just looking. Thank you. Yeah, very cool.
If anybody wanted to know, they could contact me. They could look my name up on the membership list, or send me an email, or I could put it on the chat if they were interested in getting some information and contacting this fellow.
Yeah. The chat is.
Let me put it on the chat.
Yeah.
I'll put my name and I'll put my email on it, and people could contact me if they wanted to check it out.
Yeah, and speaking of the chat too, I'm just looking through it now, and yeah, call attention to St. Petersburg, which I had on the screen but didn't talk so much about. I know we have a link there in the chat to their signs of historic significance in the city code, which is an awesome example of a good, I think, a good city code and ways of doing a lot of these things with the city as well. And they have some great videos of our SCA visit to St. Petersburg a few years ago that are up on the city website as well, which I think is awesome. Yeah. I'm just looking through to see if there's any other questions in the chat. Yeah, cool. Oh, yes, and my wonderful wife Rachel has posted the link in the chat to the thesis if you want to download it easily. Cool. Oh yeah, thanks everyone for sticking around for the long haul. Hope we got your money's worth today. If we had a bumpy first 10 minutes. Yeah, forgotten all about that by now.
Thanks so much. It was great. I'm gonna sign off now. Good night, folks.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Thanks. Great to see everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate y'all being here, supporting the SCA.
There's never too much neon.
That's right.
see you all next month, June 20.
Yes, come back next month.
All right. Well, I'll just end it all.
Thanks, Michael.
Good night. Thank you. Thanks all.